thank you all for being interested. This is a bit of a teaser for our proceedings edition that will come out this year. Every year we publish an annual journal called The Proceedings. This year's topic is on the Reconstruction period, which is my professional specialty. I did all the research and wrote this year's volume. So this is one of the chapters to kind of hopefully get everybody excited. This is also something that's not really talked about in Clarke County, which is interesting. We'll see. All right. So sometime in the fall of 1865, Joseph Dorsey walked into the Freedmen's Bureau office on Cork Street in Winchester to make a formal complaint. He alleges that James Kiger had agreed to pay him $10 a month for labor between April and December 1864. This should have earned Dorsey about $90 in wages, a substantial sum of money for a newly freed man. Although he may have been free, we're not totally sure. But Kiger never pays the amount due. Dorsey does allow that Kiger gave him 15 pounds of salt pork, but this is not really enough food to sustain one person for 9 months of labor. It's not really the agreed upon terms either. Dorsey was well within his rights to complain to the Bureau. They were, in fact, the governing body responsible for overseeing the transition of formerly enslaved people into freedom. Yet it does not appear that Dorsey ever really got his full amount. There's a whole list of letters and things that go back and forth between the parties involved. And I think at the end, if my math is correct, there's still like $5 missing from the amount that Dorsey's due, and the letters continue through to like 1867. So we're now 3 years beyond the labor contract period where he's still owed money. After the war, the newly freed population knew that they needed to assimilate into the dominant culture to survive. And they knew that it was going to be hard. There's no question that individuals and family units needed to earn money to support themselves. But the white population was incredibly cash and resource poor, and they resisted the Bureau's efforts to create a fair market for black labor. Because of course they did. Joseph Dorsey's story is unfortunately one of many such stories in the county of freedmen being defrauded by their white employers. The Bureau, he was lucky enough to be able to draw on the Bureau for assistance, but the Bureau only lasted until 1872. And they're completely unable to manage the market like they want to. So it's a moot point almost from the start, unfortunately. So there are other records of black labor outside of the Bureau records. I could probably drone on for hours. So for today, we're just going to look at the Bureau records because they give us so much more information at first glance, and it's less kind of mental gymnastics to understand what exactly is going on. If you have questions about every other thing, feel free to ask at the end. Otherwise, this is just going to be on the Bureau stuff. So in April 1865, shortly after the surrender of Appomattox, John Hatch, military commander of the Department of the South, which was a military council in charge of Union troops and officials throughout the South, wrote, "Numerous applications had been made to me for the information as to the policy to be adopted on the subject of labor. In the present unsettled state of the country, and in the absence of any official comment, and the absence of any recognized state authorities, I find it my duty to assume control of the plantations." So he's speaking about the former plantations that are now in a little bit of a weird spot because labor doesn't quite exist anymore. This is the first official comment by the U.S. government in regard to the issue of black labor after the official surrender of the Confederacy. Hatch's goal was to set a precedent for his successors that required labor contracts to be submitted to the nearest military commander for approval and endorsement. So we're already paving the way for an official system of things to happen. And this concept of the concept of labor oversight quickly shifts to the Freedmen's Bureau. So it starts with Hatch, who is not in the Freedmen's Bureau, and then it shifts to the Freedmen's Bureau very soon after, as they become the governing body responsible for easing formerly enslaved peoples into freedom. So there's a lot of boring information in the beginning because the setup for everything is really tenuous. No one really knows what is going to happen, how it's going to happen, and how it's going to play out on the government side of things. We knew that the Freedmen's Bureau was going to exist. Yes, ma'am.
Can you explain the Freedmen's Bureau, what that is?
Yes. So the Freedmen's Bureau is, and I always butcher the full title, so I'm not going to say it, but it is a government agency set up to protect the newly freed slaves, to acquire and redistribute abandoned lands that were owned by white farmers, white Southerners in the South, and just kind of help oversee the shift of everything. And so their official title is much longer, and I'm really going to screw it up, so I'm not going to try. So that's what I mean. Does that answer your question? Okay. That's what I mean when I talk about the Freedmen's Bureau, is the body kind of overseeing everything. And we know that they do handle a lot of abandoned lands in the Clarke and Frederick regions, but there's less clear documentation about it. So in my work, I mostly look at the Freedmen's Bureau and the labor side of things, because that's super documented, because people want to get paid. And when they don't, they complain. So then the Freedmen's Bureau, as Hatch's grand plan, he was not part of the Bureau, the Bureau assumes his plan, and they fall drastically short of his plans, so it doesn't come to fruition the way that he wants it to. A lot of agents in the Bureau, so it's a government agency usually staffed by Union troops or Union agents. So it's a Union government, it's not a Confederate government or a Southern government that's taking over. It's all the North and the Union who's doing it. Which is a big reason why it's so contentious later on. A lot of these agents believe in their mission, but many do not. A dislike of slavery does not and did not equate to a belief in racial equality, and a large number of Bureau agents had absolutely no vested interest in helping these freedmen achieve it, even though that's the mission of the Bureau. So you can kind of see how that's going to cause some problems. Also, the Bureau fails to have regional and national support that it needs to be successful. So the South is already war-torn, it's already damaged from the war. You all know this. When a Northern Union group comes in and establishes itself as the umbrella organization, it's not going to go well. A lot of the South really resists what's going on. After the war, wage labor becomes the dominant way in which freedmen could make a living. With our present-day capitalist mindsets, this seems really obvious, but in the moment, things weren't so cut and dry. Nobody quite knew what was going to happen when the war ended. It just wasn't clear. And the white society was not yet wage-driven like it would be in subsequent generations and decades. So the rise of the capitalist system and industrialization hasn't quite hit yet. So the fact that you're going to work for a wage, for a living, it's not a new concept, but it's not the established concept. It's not really how the South had operated up to this point. Northern officials and Bureau agents are hoping that the introduction of labor contracts will fundamentally alter the societal and economic relations that had been created by slavery. That slaveholders and former slaves will transform into new people, which is a bit of wishful thinking. They're going to become employers and employees, whose relationship was mediated by an impersonal market rather than personal sovereignty. So they're setting the stage for what we now recognize as a capitalist market system, and they want to remove all of the emotion out of it, which we know doesn't happen. And thank goodness it doesn't, because we have a lot of records that we'll talk about in a second. So the late 1860s, we haven't got capitalism yet, but the seeds are being sown during this time, which is important. However, the ability for freedmen to advocate for themselves was vastly underestimated. This is unsurprising. The vast majority of white Americans saw people of color as fundamentally lesser than. Local white employers were in for a shock when black laborers began taking means into their own hands when it came to finding reasonably waged work. So just like we see across the South under enslavement, the white population doesn't believe that the newly freed people can manage this for themselves. They actually can. I don't know, well, it was shocking to planters. So this news article here appears in the New York Herald on October 24th, 1865, which is one day less than exactly 6 months from the notice that Hatch sent out about labor. So 6 months later, this hits the New York Herald and a couple others. And it reads, quote, "The colored population in Clarke County, Virginia, are reported to have become considerably aroused and excited by reason of the injudicious statements of some of the landowners of that section, claiming that the right to fix a price for the labor of the black will rest alone with the employer. The colored population are apprehensive that their labor is to be exacted merely under another form, but no less absolute and dependent than it was under the slave code, and are consequently restlessly eager to learn the truth of the matter." So a lot of the buildup in the 6 months, the end of the war, now October 1865, the Bureau comes in and they establish that there needs to be a precedent for how do the newly freed people earn a living? How does it happen? And they also recognize that the white Southern people, who formerly held those freed people enslaved, would probably try and muddy the market. And that's exactly what happens. The white farmers, who themselves are usually cash and resource poor, although it's not they are intent and determined to pay as low wages as possible, which is what happens in a capitalist society, but that's not the point. It's interesting to see how the lines are going as we get into the second half of the 19th century. And the Bureau recognizes that the effort is there to pay as little as possible for these people, for their labor, who are in many instances doing the same tasks that they were doing while enslaved. So you see farm laborers, you see domestic servants, the whole 9 yards. Now there's a wage for it, and that wage is being contested. And this is what happened. And I love that it's from Clarke County because there's just so little documentation in newspapers especially about what's going on in the county during this period. Everybody's really quiet about it. Yes.
How did that article or that get into a New York paper?
Somebody had to have sent it. And I couldn't tell you beyond that how it got there. Because the New York Herald at this point has a massive readership. So somebody
cared?
Somebody cared. And we do know, during the war, it was pretty clear that Clarke County was a Confederate sympathizing county. After the war, it became clearer that not, be careful how I phrase this because I don't want to just throw generalizations out there. Not everyone was quite as sympathetic as they claimed. There seems to be, I want to make it vague enough that no one yells at me later because I don't have all the answers yet. There seems to be a large, I don't even want to say large, enough of a group of people in the county who are anti-Confederate, it feels like. And I'm being incredibly vague because I don't have all the answers at the moment. But with some of the records that survive, you can see enough of the population claiming, I don't even want to say Union sympathies, but they're not Confederate. It's that weird little gray area. All that to say, somebody had to have cared enough that this was going on communicated to the Herald.
So in order for it to have been published, it had to have been a white person who sent that article?
Not necessarily, because you typically would send it through the mail. So there was a small free population in Clarke County who could have been literate. I don't know enough about them to say if they were or not. Could have been, probably were, literate enough to compile an article and send it off. And this is news grabbing enough to make it into the newspaper without kind of any questions being asked. That's a good story that people are going to be interested in reading this soon into, this soon into 1865. So it was probably somebody whose life could have not been. It's one of those things where it shows up in the Herald. There's a Shenandoah newspaper, and that's it. I don't think it shows up anywhere else that I have found. Hopefully someone else does. Yes?
I think you answered my question. Were there any rebuttals or editorials concerning the article?
Nothing that was printed in the paper. However, this was a sort of rebuttal that the Freedmen's Bureau took notice of the article. So the next day, let's see. Make sure I got the right information. Okay, so the next day, which is October 25th, 1865, article published October 24th, so news spread incredibly fast. This letter is from Orestes Brown, Colonel and Assistant Commissioner of the Bureau, who's pretty high up in the ranks. And he is writing to Captain Howe, who is managing the Winchester branch, who oversees Frederick County, Clarke County, a little bit of Warren, a little bit of Shenandoah, etc. And this says, the important bits, there's general greeting stuff. It says, if any such trouble exists, you will report its nature at once. If the statement in the Herald is false, you will advise me without delay. So the Bureau has taken notice that something is going on in Clarke County. And this is the only, I was so excited when I found this, it's the only instance that I could find of a response to what's going on. I do know, and I thought I saved it, and it didn't show up in my records when I went back to compile the slides. There was, and I couldn't tell you the date, sometime in the early 65, 66, 67 time frame, might have been around this time, a report that was written to somebody in the Bureau about what appeared to be, I'm going to call it a labor riot, which is bigger words than I want to use, but I don't really know how else to kind of shrink it down. It looks like there were at least a group of freedmen in Berryville who were disgruntled enough that somebody wrote about it. And I wanted to find, there's a letter, it's so great. I want to say there was a gathering of people, and I want to say rocks were being thrown. It's like something was happening. There's enough going on that somebody noticed and wrote to the Bureau and said, hey, what the heck is happening? And I remember, I chuckled because they said something about, there was church in session. So Sunday, church in session, which was happening outside of church, and they're like, well, you know, there's no relation to anything going on. It's just, you know, they're just, it was great. But it seems like something is happening in Clarke that is big enough for the Bureau and other local residents to kind of take notice. I wish it was published, because that would be great. But I have not. Hopefully someone does. I have not found anything yet kind of in response. But the reason that all of this is so incredibly interesting but also dangerous is because we're still only 6 months out of enslavement. And under enslavement, the threat of rebellion was huge. Harpers Ferry, right down the street. We had our own almost insurrection just after John Brown in the county as well, which alarmed a lot of people. And now we are 6 months out of enslavement with the threat of a possible rebellion underway. there's no indication that it ever gets that big. People have been disgruntled about labor for millennia. However, we're still in that time frame where nobody really knows what's going to happen. So the Bureau was watching from Winchester. They did have an office in Berryville for a hot second, but really from Winchester, and they're just kind of keeping an eye to see what happens. And it's interesting, if anything had happened, the Bureau doesn't contain enough agents on the ground to quell anything like an uprising. I don't like those words, but there's just not the manpower on the ground that's going to be effective. So they're trying to be careful and quell it, and just kind of keep an eye on everything.
Sorry, can you touch about the population demographics in African Americans to the rest of the population?
Yes. So I can give you information at 1860. I don't have good numbers for right after the war because there's so much movement. But Clarke is a slave county, so we are a majority enslaved up until the 1850 census. We are a white minority by a decent margin. In 1860, it flips. There's something like 286 white people extra as opposed to enslaved. So the balance has shifted by like less than 300 people. And I think we're looking at, do I have these numbers with me?
So is that shift due to enslaved people moving out, or?
It's unclear what's going on. I don't, ask me at the end and I'll pull up the exact numbers for you.
Okay.
Because I don't think I have them. They're on my computer, which will broadcast up there. It's unclear why that shift happens in 1860. By economic standpoint, slavery is not a failing economic system. It's still profitable. So there's no reason for the white population to sell off or, whatever, otherwise reduce the number of enslaved they own. There's no reason for that. I suspect it could be a little bit of, because I think, ask me at the end, because let me look at the numbers. I have the population data. I'll pull up the numbers and we can look at it. Yes?
No, it's just,
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll pull up the population data.
It could also have to do with how the census were taken in 1850 versus 1860.
It could.
could it be a migration to the north to fight?
It could be, although the white population, I believe, increases. So I think it's more of a southward migration, which is, we're right on the border. So generally speaking, to our north, Berkeley and Jefferson counties now in West Virginia are also slave counties. So you're not going to go south to escape the slavery thing that's here. But you're also, it's interesting. I'm not sure. I'm trying to think of why would there be a good reason, and I can't off the top of my head come up with a reason why that population.
Sorry, did you stop?
No, this is good. This is good. This is so.
Question though, I'm just curious.
Yes.
Why an article that's talking about Clarke County down in Virginia, how did it make the threshold that the New York paper would actually publish it?
I think it's sensational enough that it's going to attract the readership. It's not unusual for other articles from other localities to make it into other newspapers. One absolutely bizarre instance, unrelated to any of this, there's a research person I've been tracking for a couple of years, and I know where she's supposed to be in a specific year. I think it's the 1920s or whatever. And I can't find her where she's supposed to be. She's supposed to be there. I know she's supposed to be there. Found her in a news article talking about the location she's living in Utah. So I don't know, aside from, hey, that's kind of a weird thing going on in the South, I don't really know that there's any sort of logic behind why this, why then, why now.
Slow new days.
Yeah, I think it's just sensationalist enough that the hope, because the New York Herald has a big readership, so whoever sent in the article was hoping that it would get a big readership. Why? Don't know. Maybe they wanted to draw attention to it, maybe they wanted, but I think it checked all the boxes that day. And please keep asking questions. So all of the purpose of my research talks are, they're developing research, so I don't have all the answers, and you guys asking questions helps. So please ask questions, don't get back. So yes, all right. Any other questions about the news article? Yeah.
Not this news article, but since you asked for more questions, had the Clarke Courier resumed publication after the war?
So the Clarke Courier doesn't exist until after the war.
Oh.
It doesn't exist until 1869. All Clarke County newspapers stopped production sometime in the 1860s, usually because of the war. So I think the one that lasted the longest was, I think it's the Clarke Journal and Advertiser, which is generally just a precursor to the Courier. But all the newspapers were published in Berryville, somewhere in the town, because we were the biggest, I'm going to say industrial, that's not the word I mean, the biggest industrial center of Clarke County. And we were not under constant occupation, but we were an occupied area for a decent chunk of the war. So when the soldiers came in, much of the local economy kind of stopped, and local industry stopped because the soldiers kind of overran everything. So the newspapers ceased to exist, which is such a shame because I'd love to know what was going on. We have a couple of diaries and things from the era that cover these dates, and diaries are wonderful because there's such windows into like random people, but there's excuse me, these random people don't write about the things that we think they should have written about. And it's so frustrating. The one person I can think of off the top of my head who doesn't, for instance, when the surrender happened and the slaves were now free, there was no universal announcement of emancipation. It kind of rolled, depending on when word got to you. We know that Clarke County emancipation hit somewhere in the end of April, 1865, because we're very close geographically to Appomattox. It just kind of spiraled up. So it happened very quickly. The diaries that we have that cover April 1865 do not mention any instance. And you would think that would be a big kind of writing thing, because all the diaries we have are of wealthy white people who had a vested interest in not losing their enslaved workforce. Yeah, they don't talk about it. So, don't know. Would be nice. But, all that to say, keep a diary and write everything. Alright, so, to combat all of the uprising and the discomfort that we're seeing in the county, the Freedmen's Bureau decides to issue a standardized labor contract. This is more or less what it looks like. There are regional variations. These are the ones for our area, Winchester, Frederick, Clarke, etc. It's very blurry because the scans aren't amazing. But you can kind of see it's got a date across the top. You've got space for names of employer and employee, term of, a contract length, term of work, the person doing the labor, what they're going to be doing, how much they're going to be paid, where everybody lives. It's got everything. And importantly, for this specific contract, but the situation in general, you are required, this says witness, it's very blurry, you're required to have witnesses, and they have to sign off. And this is because it was incredibly easy to fake these So this particular one is between Benjamin F. Edwards, who is the white farmer, Weston Knight, who is the laborer. He's agreeing to be a farm laborer for 4 months, and Edwards is going to pay him $40. So that's about $10 a month, is for this one. Both of them are illiterate, so they both sign with X, is their mark, and then the clerk, who is writing all of this down, is signing the names for them. So that is not their personal handwriting, they are illiterate, which is why there are 2 witnesses, 1 for each side, to guarantee authenticity, as it is. Okay, so keep all this in mind as we go forward. Here are 11 surviving labor contracts. There are more. These are the obvious ones. These more or less show up either on a standardized form or with standardized language, so it's super easy to find. They will date from 1865 to 1866. Oh, this is 67 there too. I missed him. And they give us a pretty good idea of what this system is looking like. So the average pay tends to be about $10 a month. Don't know if that is the Bureau's efforts to standardize the wages, remember the news article from a little bit ago, or if that's just kind of how it happened. There's no, as far as I can find, no correspondence stating that $10 is the average, but it doesn't mean it's not out there. Which means I haven't found it yet. And pretty consistently you see a term length of 1 year. 1 calendar year is pretty easy to keep track of. The ones who are serving longer terms are usually underage. So Mary is 16, William is 14, Albert, unknown, but it stipulates that he's a minor, so he's underage. And they are apprentices serving longer years, or longer terms. So they're going to serve usually until they're about 21, although for women, it tends to be a little bit different. No, I just can't do math. So they're going to serve until about 21-ish. So the duties performed are, like I said earlier, going to mimic what they're doing under enslavement. So farm laborers, servants, household duties, etc. There's not really any opening for variation in what's going on here. The white established population is really interested economically and socially in keeping the status quo as best we can. So you don't see a lot of shift from this. There's just now money involved, which maybe is a perk, but probably not, as we'll talk about in a second. So everything that happens on a contract has to be agreed upon by both parties. It has to be the white farmer and the black laborer have to agree. Now, the interesting thing that I mentioned earlier with this, where we have witness signatures, these are incredibly easy to forge. Because most, if not, well, I'll just say most, newly freed people who are entering into these contracts, generally speaking, cannot read or write, which means they have no way of knowing what they're signing, what they're agreeing to. So it's fairly easy for the white farmer to say, you're going to do X, Y, and Z. Are you okay with that? And the farmer or the laborer will say, yeah, sure. Sign the paper. But the paperwork says something different. So the reason you need a witness is to guarantee the authenticity of both sides. And the Bureau steps in to oversee this process to help attempt to make it fair. It doesn't work that way, but that's the goal and the idea. These contracts don't offer a lot of incentive for the white farmer to follow. There's no reason for them to do it other than they feel like they should. There's no law, there's no overseen statute, nothing like that. There's also nothing stopping them from not using the system and entering into private contracts, which we do see a lot of in Clarke County. We have a couple instances of those happening outside of the Bureau, and it's also very common for you to be a day laborer. So you will contract yourself for one day, one specific job, to one person, they'll pay you at the end of the day or the week or whatever, and you'll be on your way. That's incredibly common later into the 1860s. Yes.
How about the penalty fee?
The penalty fee. So, when you agree to a labor contract, you are agreeing to a set of terms that will be kind of carried through. The penalty fee, which is the most interesting part, I think, is what the laborer is required to pay their employer if they break the contract for any unagreed upon reason, which is a pretty slippery slope. And if you use your math brains for a hot second, so if we think about the fact that we're getting approximately $10 a month is the standardized wage, more or less, the penalty fee, and all of these here are for 1 year contracts. So $10 a month for 1 year. This is 3 months' wages, 1 month's wages. This is only a half month, 2 months' wages. So the penalty for breaking the contract for the laborer breaking the contract is several months' wages being returned to the employer, which is the interesting part about this is that a lot of the labor contracts stipulate that you do not get paid monthly, you get paid at the end. So, yes, keep that in mind, because we're going to come back to that in a second. First,
Is this black and white? With the whites under the same system?
No.
No? They didn't have to do contract.
no. So the white, I'm going to phrase this very carefully. This is another one I don't have all the answers to. I know. The poor white farmers in Clarke County are in an economic conflict with the now black laborers in the county, because now they have to compete for the same jobs. So under enslavement, there was a pretty standardized strata of socioeconomic condition. So slaves are at the bottom, poor whites on top, and then it goes up. The poor white people are doing the menial day labor jobs. So they will go paint your fence rails for $1 or whatever. And the enslaved, well, do the enslaved things, right? It's a very standardized system of labor. After emancipation, all of those newly freed people are now competing with the poor white population for the same jobs. And we don't have a lot of information about them because at this point, the poor whites tend to fade away because they are less, I don't want to say less of a problem, but less of a problem socially than the new freed population that needs to figure out how to fit in. So, all that to say, I do not have an instance of a poor white person signing a labor contract like this. However, would not surprise me to find that it's the same system, because the white farming elite is going to view all laborers more or less the same on a big picture umbrella statement. Race plays in just like it always does, but from a labor standpoint, all kind of the same. As we get into the latter half of the 19th century, you see a bit more mixing in terms of white laborers alongside of black laborers. In the early just freedom days, you kind of see the white people disappear because they're not the center of, they're not the focus of concern.
I mean, they disappear in terms of reporting anything.
Yes.
I mean,
Yeah, so they don't just poof. They don't just go.
I didn't know where they were.
But no, in terms of recording and what's kind of getting looked at and everything like that, they tend to kind of fade away because they're not the center of the economic focus, and they come back into the picture later on in the...
Are there any records of trade skill freedmen, say carpentry, masonry, blacksmithing, that were independent? Do you have contracts of that kind of operation?
I do not have contracts for them, which is intriguing because under enslavement, Clarke County has a fairly high population of skilled enslaved workers. I can't justify, or I can't quantify that beyond that statement, but there does seem to be a fairly high population of skilled work being done. After the war, after emancipation, I do not see, doesn't mean it doesn't exist, just that there's no records available. I don't see any contracts or any oversight for those people. I suspect there's a little bit, because if you possess a skill to such quality that you're able to capitalize on it under enslavement, so you are the person who does the thing. After you are now your own economic person, there's nothing really stopping you from being able to turn that into a business venture. And that's a little more idealistic, perhaps, than it was in reality. But you already have an established clientele, if you will. So there's already white people and not white people who know what you do. So it would, in theory, be easier for you to establish your own trade versus unskilled labor, which is general farm labor, is kind of my thought. One of the things I'm interested in developing beyond this is the skilled labor, because what happens to everybody? There's also something that isn't taken into consideration here. There is a mass, very quickly after emancipation, there's a big shift in population where people are trying to find each other again, they're trying to leave, they're coming in, and so there's a mix-up in the population. So it's possible a lot of the skills leave the county in search of better economic possibilities. It's already known at this point that, like, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, the big cities up north are going to have friendlier spaces-ish, different, than what you're going to see in the South. So it wouldn't surprise me to find that a lot of them leave and try and make it elsewhere, because there's a lot of migration going on. And in the records themselves, you see a lot of freedmen from all over Virginia writing to the Bureau saying, hey, my children are, there's one woman I can think of specifically, she's in Stanton, I believe, and her children are in Clarke County. So she's writing to the Bureau and saying, hey, my kids are up here, I want them, send them down to me. And so the Bureau arranges for them to be shipped down to rejoin each other, which is really cool. So it wouldn't surprise me if there's a little bit of that going on with trades as well, where the Bureau is kind of stepping in to help move. I also don't want to give them too much credit, because the Bureau does fail. They're a little more grandiose than reality, or than what happened in reality. But very long answer. I haven't found any. I hope I'll find one soon. Make sure I know what I'm talking about. Okay, so this is. Before we get to the slippery slope of the wage thing, this is a letter written by, where did I write his name? Okay, J.H. McKenzie, who's the Assistant Superintendent of the Frederick County Region. So he's in the office in Winchester. He's writing this to Mr. Buck Ashby, who is a big farmer here in Clarke County. And he says, this letter says, quote, Dan Williams, a colored man, complains that he worked for you for a period of 1 month, and that you agreed to pay him $10 per month and have failed to do so, and that you refused to allow him to take away his personal clothing. Excuse me, these are the facts. Excuse me. I would advise you to settle with him and give up his clothes. Please send me your statement of this case or call this office. So it's really fun. I love a good historic complaint because they leave so much wonderful records. Dan is not the only one who is complaining about being defrauded by their white employers. So the labor contracts, while good in thought, not so great in practice, there's nothing holding the white population to them, in the same way that the black population is now economically tied to that contract. This is another one from, oops, helps if I change my own slide. Here we go. This is another one from Thomas Blakemore, who was contracted to George C. Blakemore, who lived off Route 7, headed to Winchester. And same thing, he he put on all the crops, he sowed the corn, he planted the corn, he harvested the corn. He was not allowed to keep a portion of the corn, which is what he was contracted to get in return. This is interesting because this is a very clear example of that descent into that wage problem. And this is indicative of something much more dangerous for Black workers, which is sharecropping. I cannot tell you how many times people have told me that sharecropping didn't exist in Clarke County. It did, okay? Rest assured, it did. We have the records, we can prove it. So sharecropping is, by definition, a system where the landlord or planter allows a tenant to use the land in exchange for share of the crop. And the theory is that the tenant will retain a portion of the crop, and the rest will be paid to the landlord in rent. Where he will sell that at a higher market price, thus making his money. So the reality, of course, as we all know, is very different. Sharecropping is incredibly dangerous because the tenants are now encouraged to produce as much as possible, and the landlord is encouraged, mostly by himself, to take as much as he can, leaving just enough for the tenant to survive. And as the system kind of keeps going, the negative implications get bigger. So, many instances, the planter will also supply the seed, the tools, the shed, whatever, that the laborer will live in, use, work, etc. And those come at a price, because the white farmer is just not going to give these things out of the goodness of their hearts. They haven't done anything like that yet. And so, the fee from what the farmer or the tenant is able to produce increases. So whereas before, assuming that the planter gave them nothing and just required a share of the crop, the tenant got enough to survive on. Maybe enough to sell a little extra and get some pocket cash. The more things the planter provides to the tenant, the more he extracts from the crop grown. So that tiny little survivable chunk shrinks, shrinks, shrinks. To the point where now, in order to survive, the tenant must rely on the planter to supply basic human needs: food, shelter, and clothing. Ignoring all of the economic or the agriculture stuff that needs to, be supplied for the crops. This is that really dangerous system. Now add into that the wage aspect, where they're getting paid at the end of the year, and now they're not being given the food that they've raised to either eat or sell. You start to see that entrenchment. This is sharecropping. This is wage slavery. This is the descent down into it all.
Melanie?
Yes.
Curiosity question, so just how successful was this? So, like the poor guy with the clothes, and they get the letter, please give the clothes back to the guy. Was there a follow-up, and what's the consequences if he doesn't?
So, I do not have an answer for Thomas, what's his face? Dan, who didn't get his clothes. I don't know what happened. There is no recorded follow-up that I have found. I do know in other instances where the laborer is complaining that he is missing his wages, and I have them back. There usually are a series of letters that exchange. And there's a Freedmen's Bureau court that is established to hear these kind of cases. So you have been defrauded, you write in your claim, this is what happened, this is what I'm missing, this is who did it. The Bureau responds and sends a letter to your employer. What's going on? Call me. They communicate as to what's happening, Sometimes you will retain your own counsel. This is not nearly as legally established as a normal court of law. But some nice white man will come in and vouch for your character. Yeah, he's telling the truth. The story that I opened with, Joseph Dorsey, that's what happens to him. A white guy, not sure what the relationship is, but he steps in and vouches for Dorsey and says, yes, he has been defrauded, etc., etc. Letters exchanged, people just conveniently missing in the office, which is my favorite. It happens so many times. I can't believe it's not a coincidence, or it's not on purpose. And some sort of conclusion is reached. In the case of Dorsey, he got money, had to pay money, got more money, didn't get the full amount. In the case of Dan and his clothing, I'm not sure. There's another woman who had the same situation. I believe she got her clothing. But there's not, I didn't include it in the slide, but it's in the proceedings. There is one guy. So the white farmer is in Clarke, he's in Frederick, he's in Clarke, he's in West Virginia. He kind of moves around. The bureau's chasing him, trying to track him down so his worker can get paid. And one of the letters the bureau wrote to him says something like, answer the call or we will take measures to come and find you, or something like that. I wish I knew the outcome of whether or not some soldiers showed up at the door. But the reality of the situation was the black population is economically dependent on the white population, especially this early on. The white population is not quite as dependent on the black population as the vice versa. And all of that, including the Bureau, so we are under the Reconstruction period, is 1865 to about 1876-ish. And it is a period of martial law over the South, which means there are troops stationed in the area to oversee law and order. Heavily aircraft on them. There aren't enough troops, soldiers, between the ones who are stationed here and the ones associated with the Bureau to enforce anything. So I don't have an instance of what happens to the white side of things, but don't you do it again, is probably what happened. There's no, most of what you see, the records are incomplete, so most of what you see is going to regard the black population. That's the majority of the correspondence. I've yet to find the other side, but I'll do it.
Were these contracts extended to the women and children?
Yeah, they were. So these are gender and age neutral, so anyone can form a contract. You saw earlier employees here. All right, so Jim Lewis is contracted with his wife and children, so they are all working for that fee. Henry and Diana as well, but Matilda is on her own. She is a legal adult. Mary is an adolescent. She's not yet of age, but she is contracted on her own. William is on his own as well. He's 14. Albert, we don't know his age, but we know he's a minor. It stipulates in his contract. And so anyone could enter into a labor contract. The challenge is finding someone who will accept your labor. Female domestic labor is valued lesser than male domestic labor because men can do more or something like that. So it's pretty, whoever kind of wants to can. The kids are interesting. We don't have a lot of them, so I don't have enough to kind of conclude what's going on. But they seem to be bringing back the old English system of apprenticeship, where it's a 7-year term, they turn 21, and they have a skill that they can then go do whatever. These two have specific contracts, 3 rather, have specific contracts, stating the terms, but I do see a lot of correspondence between white farmers and the Bureau saying, such and such child is bound out to me, such and such child is bound out to this guy over there. The woman in Staunton who is trying to reach her children up here, they are allegedly bound out to somebody up here. She's trying to find them. Which leads to an interesting set of letters where the farmer who's supposed to have them says, no, I don't have them, they're over there. So I'll just say yes, you can. It can be men, women, children, together, separate, some combination thereof.
Well, so I saw that those were teens. I was wondering about like the 10-year-olds and the 8-year-olds, the children.
I'm going to say yes, because labor is labor. A lot of those letters that mention the binding out don't mention ages. I suspect if the age is not listed, it's unknown, which could go either direction, but definitely opens a possibility for younger children to be apprenticed as well. And we know that under enslavement, children started working fairly young, and that there's no reason for that to change now that money's involved. And there's a lot of orphans as well, tragically, who need somewhere to go. The poorhouse takes over some, but they're also involved in the spread now. So, yes.
Hi, thank you for a great presentation. I love this topic. I wonder if you found evidence of cooperation between black and white farmers after emancipation and before Jim Crow in Clarke County, or
Cooperation in what way?
cooperative farming with mixed races after emancipation and before Jim Crow.
I have not looked in that avenue yet. So I have spent the last, year or so on this specific research, which is just the early part. So stay tuned for what comes next. I would not be surprised to find a little bit more cooperation on the ground, simply because economic survival necessitates it. Clarke is small. There is a poor white population before emancipation as well. They need to survive. They didn't just get pushed out. They also needed to survive. So it wouldn't surprise me, but I can't say definitively yes or no, because at the moment, I don't know. But
Thank you.
stay tuned. Yes. Somebody else had a question. Yes.
Are there contracts for sharecropping?
They're not this early in explicit language. However, this one. So we are still a little bit early for the established system of sharecropping, which is, it applies to white tenants as well as black tenants. It's pretty racially neutral. The later system. If you're poor, you suck is pretty much how that one works. We are early still. We're not quite there yet, but this contract, so this is December 1866, between O.R. Funston and Joe Brown. So, white farmer, black employee. Funston agrees to pay Brown $160 a year, but Joe is required to furnish his stepson as a laborer as well. So we don't know if there's extra money for the extra man. Probably not. Excuse me. The contract also states that Joe is going to use the house near the sulfur spring with the garden attached, but he has to pay rent for the house. It's $2 a month. If Joe wants to use a cow, or if one's use of a cow, he can rent one for $1.75 a month. With pasture included, very magnanimously. Funston agrees to pay, to furnish food for Joe and the stepson, whose name is Dick. And assuming that Joe will live in the house for 1 year and rent the cow for the same term, he is going to pay $3.75 a month in rent for house and cow. His yearly salary is $160, so he's making $13.33 a month. If you adjust that for rent, his income drops to $9.58 a month. which is about the $10 average. So in all, not miserable. Asterisk. His contract states that he will get paid at the end of his term. It does not state if he will pay the monthly fee each month, or if it will be deducted from his annual salary at the end. Regardless, that $160 only doesn't cover clothing, doesn't cover food. Well, it says he's going to be fed, but doesn't cover shoes, doesn't cover other basic necessities, which have to be paid, you know, when you need them. You can't just really buy it on credit, unless the tenant or the landlord farmer will give them to you on credit. In which case, the money that you didn't get at the end continues to shrink. So here is where we don't use the explicit language you'll see in the later 19th century, but that means this is sharecropping. This is where we're at. And just so you know that this isn't the only one, we have another one. So this is between Jasco Thompson, who's the black laborer, and Patrick Tracy, the white farmer. Less complicated of a contract, still just as detrimental. So Jasco will rent the farm from Tracy, keep 1/3 of the crop for himself. That sounds familiar. In exchange, Tracy is supposed to furnish the house and the garden. For Jasco, feed him, provide him with seed and firewood. And then Jasco will put up the crops. There's no mention of money, but there is mention of crop exchange, which is another form of cash, or is another form of compensation. Not everybody had the ready cash to just pay outright. So just because money isn't involved doesn't mean it's not any less problematic. Because there's nothing stopping Tracy from not delivering on his promises. So Patrick Tracy, we see here, is literate. Jasco Thompson is not. We don't know. This is not a standardized form approved by the Bureau. Not that it really matters, but there are witnesses. So in theory, this contract was entered into on, honest terms. In reality, we don't know, but it's dubious, I think. There are others. For the sake of brevity, I didn't include them, but there are so many more. So this one is a similar situation. This is a standardized form with a memorandum attached to it, so it's a little bit extra that has been somehow negotiated. So this is for Henry and Diana Thomas, who contract themselves to David H. McGuire. They will be paid together $130 for the year. Henry will work as a laborer. Diana, who is his wife, will work as a servant, probably in McGuire's house, but it doesn't say. The couple are allowed to raise chickens and 1 hog, but McGuire is to be paid market price for any feed given to the hog, assuming that he supplies it. So that is deducting from the total that they make. It doesn't mention where they're living, if they have to pay rent, how they're going to feed and clothe themselves, but they also will get the lump sum at the end. See the establishment of, there's a vested interest, again, in keeping that status quo. And so if we can set up this system that will eventually become the sharecropping that we know and don't love, it keeps that status quo, and it keeps the freed society from causing issues to the white society, just like they wanted to keep it under enslavement. Yeah.
Another thing I was thinking about is, we talk about shared property. We do not know if the sun will shine and if the crops are going to produce.
Correct. Yeah. So there is, when your livelihood, that's a good point, when your livelihood depends on the crops that you grow to pay your rent, what happens if it's a bad harvest? when there's a drought, or that will increase. In later decades, you'll see that will increase your debt, which will keep you and successive generations tied to that landholder. There's no indication that that is the jump that's being made, but just because it's written down doesn't mean it's not happening. Yeah.
So if there's no law that says they have to do this, correct?
Correct.
What's the incentive for the farmer to engage in these contracts and make these contracts? Why? What's the incentive for them to do it?
The incentive for the white farmer is that they need the labor to survive. So I can speak to Clarke specifically, but this is pretty much the standard everywhere else as well. We were a very high agricultural county. And so under enslavement, the white farmer, even on a bad harvest year, had a guaranteed crop and a guaranteed labor force to handle the crop. The war absolutely economically devastated the county. And so now, because we were under such occupation, in and out, the soldiers, we were on a major byway between Harpers Ferry, Charlestown, and Winchester. We've got almost constant troop movement throughout the Civil War. Troops do what they do best and just take things from the land, because as the war progresses, both Union and Confederate forces have less funding and resources available to them. So they are reliant on the land that they're in to survive. They need firewood from fences, they need crops from the field, they steal chickens and hogs, etc. So when your wealth is tied into land, like the white planters were, when you suddenly lose both your crop and your labor force, you have to be willing to make some sort of compromise. I would really couch that one. To survive. They have a vested interest in protecting their economic standing as well, because now they have farms they can't afford, houses they can't afford, families they can't feed. And so they have a need for the labor. On the flip side, the now freed population has none of those things, but wants them. Houses, families, etc. And so they trade labor for the economic desirability of both sides. Does that make sense? So the white people, while there's nothing ultimately keeping them from just completely wrecking the system, they have an interest in getting ahead economically. It doesn't take Clarke County that long to recover. It's not an overnight, immediate change, but by the mid-1870s, we're back to almost pre-war levels. I don't have the economics to kind of couch that specifically, but we're there. It doesn't take that long, as opposed to the Deep South, where it takes generations. Yes?
What was or were the crops that brought Clarke out of penury?
We do mostly cereal grains. So then as now, or then, and then after, before and after, there we go. We're mostly doing wheat. You see, I think livestock becomes a little bit bigger after the war. Don't quote me on that. I think livestock becomes a little bit bigger after the war, but we mostly do cereal grains. To the point where my absolute favorite agriculture fact is that during the Civil War, like the early years of the war, 1850s and 1860s, Brazil is having a bread crisis. And the Shenandoah Valley supplies 90% of the grains that give them bread. And so it's exported from us, including the valley, export to Brazil. And there's like an economic little system.
What port?
Probably Alexandria. If I were to, so the general path is Clarke, up the river to Harpers Ferry, up the river to Alexandria, which is a global port. Beyond that, I couldn't tell you, but I know that there's a circle, and it's just so fascinating. And then after the war, you see grains come back as well, because the landscape is sort of suited for it. I think livestock becomes a little bit bigger. It's easier to make money, because it's less, they're not going to die in a drought. The way that crops go. Yes?
The economic recovery that you spoke of in the mid-70s, how did I understand the farmers had recovered, how did the freedmen situation look?
So what's really exciting about the mid-70s is the railroad comes in, which brings industry. And so Berryville's Industrial Revolution kind of kicks off in the 70s in through the latter half of the 19th century, which is great for the freedmen because it now brings more more people into the area, so the economy grows, and there are more people with less community ties kind of mixing around. So there's that, you see a little bit, again, I want to couch it very vaguely, you see a little bit more mixing economically speaking. In starting the late 60s into the mid 70s, you start to see the creation of black communities pop up throughout the county. You see the rise of black landowners, which is great, economically and personally. You see a lot of the black communities are created around lands purchased outright. And you see you still see a lack of those skilled trades. And I don't know if that's just me not looking in the right spot, or if there's still that lack. You still see a dependence on day laboring, and you still see a dependence on farming. The contracts by this point are out the door because the Bureau disappears in 1872. So you see a rise to in comparison, I guess, a decent economic stability, but it's never, that's still that early, it's not yet secure. You see a lot of the generation that weren't yet adults when emancipation hit, but grew up, but came of age just after. They're the ones who are able to purchase land sooner. And you see them succeed in a way that successive generations don't quite seem to. I don't want to imply that nobody after that first generation is buying property and succeeding, but it's almost like we've got to this point and then we kind of stagnate. A lot of that, I suspect, is county pressure pushing down, like just the county as a whole kind of pushing down to keep that status quo as well. A lot of it, I suspect, is also a lack of economic opportunities. With the train comes the migration out, and so the population continues to decrease, and so there's less people in the county, there's less, just on the whole, less people in the county, but specifically less black people in the county who are no longer vying for, there's no longer that push to vie for the economic position. So it kind of flattens out. Does that make sense? In my head, it sort of does.
Well, I'm just curious how they sustained their prosperity if the labor market was dwindling and people were exiting.
I have questions.
If there was not prosperity for the freedmen, then how were they sustaining prosperity for the white farmer?
Yeah. I think, and again, I don't have full answers, so I'm couching it very vaguely. I think the way that it's happening is that the white farmers are still reliant on the black labor that they can tap into external markets for profit. So you grow your crops. We're not subsistence farmers. We are commercial farmers. So you grow your crops, you pay your laborers a menial wage to harvest them, you then send them out of state to a higher market where you can get better prices when it comes back, which would bolster the white farmers without equally bolstering the freedmen. But you do see like both strata are rising to a certain point, and then everything kind of plateaus. The freedmen and the white people are able to capitalize on external markets, and we start in the latter half of the 19th century, you start to see wealthy white people enter the county who didn't have previous connections. So that system kind of bumps itself up without really helping the bottom. Does that make sense? Okay. Somebody else had a question.
Oh, I was feeling curious, thanks, I was feeling curious if you came across any honorable seeming contracts in this, labor contracts in this era.
I can't give you a straight answer. On the surface, some of the basic contracts, you grow my corn, I'll pay you part of it, seems to be fairly fine. And we do know that other labor outside of the Bureau is pretty cut and dry. So you perform a service, I pay you, and it covers. Without knowing the follow-up to some of these, I don't know if they are as honorable as they potentially appear, because the Bureau records are incomplete. So my guess is that it falls somewhere a little bit closer to the middle, right? It's never either one extreme or the other. It's usually a little bit more. So I know, like for instance, this is probably more than I should say in a recorded talk, but the contract with Funston, O.R. Funston, he's the one who had the house and the cow for rent. We know enough about him as a person to know that he wasn't the greatest guy. So my guess is that one's not a good one. But some of the other ones we know, like George C. Blakemore, seems to be fairly decent on the scale as far as the surviving records tell us. So that one could be a little bit better than definitely the Funston one. There's another one with T.P. Pendleton. Again, not the best kind of person. There's some really fun Freedmen's Bureau records about him just not being a good guy. So that one, but on the surface, I would say that most of the ones we don't know either party are probably fine. Because we don't know about them, probably not an issue.
Thank you.
Yes.
And do we see anything in the 70s and on increasing literacy in the former enslaved population?
Yes. So the Freedmen's Bureau was instrumental in bringing public schools to the newly freed people. So we see the Millwood Colored School opens in 1869, which is the earliest one I can think of, but there might have been earlier or similar aged ones. And so you do see an increase in literacy heading towards the 20th century. Absolutely. Once we hit about the 1870s, we've got a decent amount of letters written by Black people who have enough of a grasp of literacy that they can read and write coherently, which is, less than a decade out of the Civil War. So it's pretty fast. Just like economics are important, the generation specifically, not exclusively, but specifically the generation who grow up in the Emancipation and into the period after the war are the ones who are kind of pushing forward. So you see their children are absolutely enrolled in schools. Doesn't mean that the older generations didn't support it, but they have, in many instances, the ones who don't pursue literacy immediately after the war are, generally speaking, too old. Everybody else seems to kind of gather some sort of literacy, even just basic writing and reading skills, very basic, and then each successive generation improves on the last as their economic situation gets better. A lot, as you get closer, I'm blanking on all of the other founding years, but as you get into the 20th century, more and more colored schools pop up in the county, and they all serve different community populations.
And they were started by Freedmen's.
And they were started by the Freedmen's Bureau. Yes. Yep. That was probably their most successful venture after the war, was founding the schools across the South. That's the good one. Yes.
There apparently were several other economic models happening right around the same time that may have had an effect on this. There's a historian in Stevens City that did a presentation on Freetown over there. Why was there Freetown? This was before the Civil War. And he talked, this was particularly about skilled craftsmen, welders, wagon makers, wheelwrights, people with that level of skill. Apparently it was more advantageous to the owners at that time to free a person and then pay him for his labor than it was to try to set up a system where they remained enslaved. It wasn't for out of the goodness of their hearts, I'm sure, but it was more economically advantageous to do this. That was one model.
Yeah.
Another model is in the book about Robert Orrick that came out recently. Robert's owner didn't free Robert, but Robert was free to be. And Robert was expected to pay back his owner X amount of money for his time. So that's how that until the owner passed away, and then freed Robert. So it was always some machination that was in their interest. And I think I heard a reference in the room already to something that happened here in Berryville regarding one of the local plantations, in which the woman who remained after the war was unable to maintain things and was distraught over the matter. And the folks who had been her slaves, her family slaves for many years, gathered together themselves, put together a plan, and went to her and directed the matter, and basically managed. And this was like more folk tale and oral tradition. And I heard it over on Josephine Street, in a presentation over there a couple of years ago. So there was all these other models that were affecting what wage might be projected for it. So there was some negotiating room, I think, on both sides.
Yeah, for sure. And this specifically focuses on the Bureau and the contracts. But,
Yeah.
I think I mentioned earlier, nobody knew what was going to happen after the war. This is the instance where we have a lot of documentation where we can show one avenue, but there's definitely other things happening. It's very much a who's going to last the longest kind of a deal. I forgot about Freetown now. That is interesting. And I wonder.
There was a historic riot over the matter, as a matter of fact.
There was.
Some white laborers felt that it shouldn't be so. These skilled craftsmen are getting paid so much more than they got, anything like that.
Yeah, and that's part of the reason I think some of the skilled labor left
Right.
left the county, but more on that as it develops. Yes. But yeah, absolutely. There's definitely a lot of questions as to what is going on. These are, so back to the children, these are the contracts for children. So like I mentioned earlier, here's the penalty one. It follows a system of indenture like you would see almost in the 18th century. And so these are also problematic for the same ways that they are for adults. What is interesting is we don't often know if the parents are involved. So sometimes if the parents are in the area, sometimes the parents are in the area and their children are being apprenticed out to help raise money. Sometimes they are not, whether they're orphans or, dislocated or what have you. So for this one, so this is William Stannons. He is bound out to T.B. Pendleton, who is so this one, probably not good. He is going to learn how to farm, so he's apprenticed as a farmer, which is just... so his pay scale is a little bit different because he's an apprentice. So instead of a flat rate at the end, he will get a flat rate at the end. So he will not be paid a cent during his apprenticeship. But his rate will change depending on the year. So he will start at $10 a year and increase successively over 7 years until he reaches $75 in total the last year. So the total grand sum is $350 that will be paid at the end. Now, as a minor, we don't know if he is subject to the same rules as an adult. So we don't know if he is having to supply his own food and clothing, etc. I don't know. I don't really have a gut feeling one way or the other. We just don't know. But Mary Harris is up here as well. She is bound out for a 4-year term. Same thing. She'll start at $10 and increase by 5. So by the end of her 4-year term, she'll earn she'll reach $70, sorry. So over 4 years, she'll make $7, which is way less than what Stanton is making. She is a female. Female labor is undervalued. And she's not white, so it's that like, she's black and she's a girl. She makes far less. And then the last one that I have for you today is Albert Bonnion. I saved him for last because he's very interesting. So he is contracted to John G. Morris for a year as a farmhand. His pay at the end is $50. His contract stipulates that should either party break the contract, he must Contract stipulates if either party breaks the contract, either party has to pay 1 month's rent. So there is one instance, whether or not it happened, I don't know. But unless Bonnion's father decides to remove him from Morris's service. So that's the weird, like, the parents are here, but we don't know how they're interacting. So he can come in, and we don't know what happened. I'm assuming that his father didn't come in. We don't have any records, but he could have. And it's interesting that the father then gets the ultimate control over the contract, even though the father is not the one signing the contract. So it's that weird, like, children are raising money for the family, but who kind of gets that overhead side. So I will stop droning on at this point. All of these are super interesting in case you haven't. Hopefully I convinced you, but if not, these are all really cool because they give us a look into this period of Clarke history, which is usually ignored. When I was doing the research for the proceedings that's coming up, I was a little bit disappointed to find that there's just not a lot that's been looked into, as much as I would like. And it's, so these are really cool because they give us that insight without having to kind of do a lot of mental gymnastics to make all the dots connect. We have a lot of other labor information, but it's generally just a list of names and numbers. And so we have to figure out who the people are, what jobs they're doing, what the rate is. Is there a standardized rate? I haven't figured that out yet. That is where you see black and white working together, is on the at least for right now, the non-contract side of things. So the Clarke government steps in and hires laborers regardless of race. You do see, I think at least one white farmer in Millwood later on hires both black and white as well, but they're not contracted, they're day laborers. So they come in, they do a specific job, make 50 cents, go home. But all this is really interesting because it adds another layer to all of that, and it's something that we can parse together without having to think too hard about how it all fits together, which starts to paint us a nice picture of what's going on. It's really not looked into too much. And so, I don't know. It's just fun. And I will stop there. If you have further questions, I'm happy to take them. Otherwise, thank you for coming. Did not forget the population stuff. Here is my mouse. I know I have it. Here somewhere. I know I have it. I just have to find the file. It's in an appendice somewhere. I have it. Here we go. Let's see. Okay. So this is really hard to see because the screen is only so big. But I will read the numbers to you. So it goes, the bottom chart on the bottom. The top nut year is 1840, goes down by census year. So 1840, 1850, 60, 70, 80, 90, 1900. Going across the top, it reads black population, so that's enslaved. free black population, black population is total after emancipation. Free black population, enslaved population, white population, total population.
Okay, gotcha.
So let me see if I can actually make that bigger so you can see it. Here's my escape.
Oh, very
Does
good.
that work better? Yeah, okay. Okay, so, we do have a very small free black population that shrinks as you get closer to the war, if that makes sense. In 1870, you do see the black population, so this is now everybody's free, increases ever so slightly every year till 1890, and then it decreases in 1900. The corresponding then white population in 1860, so it had increased from 1850, increased, and then it keeps going up. And the increase from 60 to 70 corresponds to a decrease in population from 60 to 70. So we had 3,300 and whatever enslaved versus, and I'm adding with the free black population, corresponding to 2,150 in 1870. So you see an increase, a decrease, and the white population increases. All that to say, I'm not sure what the heck is going on between 1850 and 1860. Because economically speaking, there's no reason for the enslaved population to decrease, but it does by about 300 people. There are, not sure what's going on. Could be a lot of, like as we get closer to the war, it's pretty clear what's going to happen. It wasn't a surprise to anybody. So it could be a lot of trying to capitalize on the market before things get out of hand. So we're liquidating some of our property to capitalize on the economic
Chaos.
could be some of that. Sale records are private, so we don't have a nice handy sheet of who's selling whom when. So we don't know, is that what's happening, is it not? It's not really something that's talked about in surviving records. To the extent that maybe I'm missing something, hopefully I am. But it's not clear what's going on, because the total population in Clarke is decreasing by the same 200, even though the white population is increasing. So it's weird, and I don't know why.
I would speculate, and I'm not a historian, but you're looking at 1860, a couple years before the war, people are going to be shifting around, depending on where their allegiances might fall.
True. However,
Sorry.
what the heck? It's okay, my computer just spazzed. Stop. So the people who are shifting, so the white population from 50 to 60 is increasing, the black population is decreasing. If you're a union sympathizer, typically you're not going to be holding enslaved people. So you're not really going to be leaving town with them. Doesn't mean it didn't happen. We know that there were Quaker enslavers as well. So weird things happen. So maybe there's no mass sickness that happens. The white population isn't touched. My guess is to follow the economics, because that's typically what's going to kind of push people, but without any kind of documentation or clear answer, I don't know. Don't know what's happening. I am very glad I put this table together.
Well, that is kind of interesting because an enslaved population, it would be documented because that's merch. So they would know if they're selling and going.
Yes, except it's all done privately. It's not done through any official channels. So there's nothing.
The only plantation records and.
Right. So it'll be documented on a local plantation level. But if the records don't survive, There's no backup.
Okay,
So, yes, asterisk.
okay, yeah.
It's interesting. And I have found, because manumissions are not, they're not encouraged. They're incredibly difficult to obtain at this time. So generally speaking, if you want to free your enslaved person, it needs to be done under death through a will, or you need to do what's called giving them their time, where they're free but not, which could account for some of the mobility. I do know at least one instance, well, I know of a couple instances, but one specific one comes to head, of somebody getting their time and leaving. He doesn't stay gone, he kind of travels back and forth, but he doesn't leave. That's in 1863, it's a little bit later. So it could be a good mix of that. It could be a fluctuation. Also, white farmers, following the economics, planters are taxed on the number of enslaved that they own. And it's not a secret that if you don't want to pay your taxes, you don't report the full number. Very common. Not just in Clarke, but all across the South. So, as we get into the 60s and into the war years and the economics, state national economics kind of start to depress as we get into a war, it's possible that we're just not telling the whole truth because we don't want to lose the money. We don't want to lose more than we have to. Again, that's hard to quantify because taxes are government records, so you can look at them. But if you're lying to the government, you're probably not going to keep a super accurate count on your own records. Also, compared to some other counties in the South, it's not unique to Clarke, but I look at Clarke specifically, the white population in the antebellum period, heading into the war, does not look at the enslaved population as people, which sounds obvious, but to the point where we don't record any information. So if you look in 1850 and 1860, in addition to the federal census, the slave schedule was taken where they went through and quantified all the enslaved in the county. Sex, skin tone, as much as you can tell, age, yeah, mostly it's sex and age are the two that are kept. They record either black or mulatto, but it's subject to the census taker. It's not actually a quantification of anything. And in some counties, it's not a standardized thing, it's certainly not common, but in some counties, they will list names along to get a good Clarke does not. Same with birth records. Some counties will list the mother and the child by name. Clarke does not. Most often, they will list the white enslaver and the slave child. Don't list the mother. So, it's a little bit of that, the record should be there, but because of the way this county was set up, they just don't. They just don't. Which makes it incredibly difficult to work backwards. But, there it is. So. Yes.
Melanie, most of these shifts are in the up to 4 or 5% difference from one line to another, except for the free black population from 1850 to 1860.
Mm-hmm.
That's about a 150% drop.
Yeah.
Do you have any idea what's happening there?
That is John Brown's fault.
Oh.
So John Brown's raid in Harper's Ferry happens in 1859. I worked at Harper's Ferry, so I'm required to know that by law. So after John Brown's raid, the free populations in the area kind of panic because now, more than ever, they're under scrutiny of the white population. Because Clarke was had such a high population of enslaved leading up, the white population was very much watched. It was the threat of insurgency was very high. Right after John Brown, we had our own almost insurrection. Because two guys in the county knew there were more, but there's a whole case about it. Two of them specifically are tried for it because they talk. They know that John Brown was in the area, and they were gathering other enslaved supporters to try and foment a rebellion in correspondence to what John Brown had done. And they're found out about this because they blab. So says the trial, and they are shipped out of the country. So they are gone, and the complete trial documents for this county also don't exist. But the implication is that it's suppressed enough. I don't know what that means, but it's suppressed. And so in this gap, as we head into 1860, the freed population are watching. They have watched what happened at Harvest Ferry. They watched what almost happened in Clarke County, and they try their best to kind of just stay honest. It was, we know...
They left, or they didn't want to declare themselves?
I wouldn't be surprised if they did leave. I don't have an answer, I don't know. They are required to declare themselves. You do have to register, you have to have freedom papers, and you do have to make your presence known to the county court every so often. But it's not a standardized system, and they recommend, or the idea is I think like every 3 years you have to reapply to be free, but it doesn't always work that way. But given how close we are to everything, and how many, so there are established free communities within traveling distance of Clarke County. Wouldn't surprise me if everybody just got left, just out of personal safety. John Brown's actions really, really stirred up a lot of antagonism and fear as we head into the Civil War. So it wouldn't surprise me if they just left. We don't know, because people who don't want to be found will not be found. So, couldn't tell you, but...
Any other questions?
Billy, are the records from the Freedmen's Bureau that you showed, are they digitized? Are they online?
They sure are. You can find them on Ancestry, if you have an account. You can also find them on Family Search, which is the free version. They are wonderful. You can find them for the entire South, whatever that means, within the collection. Winchester has, so we're in the Winchester district, has 2 entries. It's the Winchester Assistant Commissioner and Sub-Assistant Commissioner, I think. And you can go in and search. You can sort of search by name. Some of the names have been indexed and pulled out. But generally speaking, you can open up. It's digitized microfilm roll, so you can open the roll and just click through the frames and just go through it. Which is why there's probably a lot of information missing from what I have, because I can only go through so much. But I've spent a lot of hours, so. But yes, they are online and they are freely accessible. All right.
All right, well, thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming out. And yes, we hope to see you next time. If anybody's got any more questions for Melanie, please come see her afterwards. But we thank you all for coming.